This is the Planetary Potential Podcast for those who are eager to explore entrepreneurship, innovation, and cross-cultural communication in exciting and interesting places around the world. And now, here's your host, Andrew P. Rowan.
Welcome to episode 20 of season 1, the final episode of this inaugural season. What are the advantages of being cross-cultural from a young age? This week, we're joined by Mariella Belli, an experienced finance and investment strategy consultant with a demonstrated history of working with social entrepreneurs in developing countries. Mariella and I first met in Vietnam in 2015 and then reconnected in July 2019 after my 5-week trip to Peru, where she was born. During our conversation, we discuss a significant move for her as an adolescent, her experiences in India and Kenya besides Vietnam, as well as her interest and passion in impact investing. An important reminder that opinions shared on this episode are those of individual guests. For more information, please visit www.andrewprowan.com/disclosures. Mariella and I also cover what it's like splitting time between different places, standing out as a strength, and give a shout out to episode 13, which, of course, was recorded earlier this season. For the final time this season, let's begin. With me is Mariella Belli. She is an independent consultant based in Washington, D.C. We are mere steps away from Logan Circle, which is where we happen to have met. It is in between Independence Days, which we'll get into in a little bit. We just celebrated the U.S. one, and of course, the Peruvian one is coming up at the end of this month on the 28th. So welcome, Mariella.
Thank you.
Now, I understand that you kind of just got back to Washington, D.C., and we missed each other when I was there in Peru in a kind of interesting way, right? We were like ships passing each other in the night.
Yes.
So how long have you been back in DC? And you've lived here before.
Thank you for having me. I moved back to DC almost 2.5 months ago. And I spent 7 months in Lima working with an organization called Nest that invests and supports social enterprises in the Andean region. And the office is based out of Lima. So I was there working with them for a short-term project. And before moving to Lima, I was based in Washington, D.C., also working as an independent consultant.
Great. So for listeners of the podcast, the name Nest might sound familiar because I interviewed Javier Gondomori, who is one of your former colleagues at
Correct.
Nest.
Yes.
Right. And so when you were at Nest, were you working closely with Javier?
So we were both portfolio managers, but we were managing different portfolios. So I actually took over some of his responsibilities because Ness recently started working with the Visa Foundation and started El Fondo Emprendedor, which is a new initiative funded by the foundation. And Javier was leading and is leading that initiative, so require more of his time. So therefore, I took over his companies that he was managing before starting the work with the Fondo Emprendedor. So yeah, so we didn't get to work overlapping a lot of work, but we always convene to kind of connect entirely as an organization and see what are the initiatives that we have and kind of keep each other updated. But we were, and of course, since he had history of working with some of the companies that I was working with, so I would always kind of rely on him to pass on some information or just keep me updated.
And so in the 7 months that you had been away from DC, did you notice any big changes or things are kind of the same? You're back into your groove, your schedule?
Yes. I mean, I left at the beginning of the winter and now it's really hot and summer now. So that.
Yes, it is super hot outside. And you were telling me before that it was worse this past weekend.
Yes. We're getting to the hundreds here, but even at nighttime. So, but yeah, so aside from the weather, everything it's
feels good to be back.
Same. Yes.
And you also have experience in the area in a more broad term because you grew up in Maryland, which is nearby. Or I should say you spent part of your childhood in Maryland. Can you talk a bit more about that? For example, when you moved to Maryland and where, in fact, did you spend your early childhood?
Yeah, so I moved to Maryland when I was 16, and I had spent up to that point, my life in Lima, and then I relocated here with my family and finished high school here in Montgomery County, and then went to University of Maryland in College Park to finish up my bachelor's degree there in accounting and finance, and then stayed here for my first year out of college and then moved to New York. Started my career in structured finance, so more in the financial services sector for the first 6 years. And so, yeah, my family lives in Rockville, Maryland, so I always come here. And now my family is split between Peru and the US, so it's hard when people ask me sometimes where is home, and for me it's more where my parents are, so because that's where I come to spend the holidays. And yeah, so Rockville is definitely my home away from home.
And how far away is Rockville from here, let's say, driving?
About 30 minutes.
30 minutes. Oh,
Yeah.
that's pretty close. You can
Yes.
pop over on the weekends
Yes.
and spend time with the folks. What was that transition like for you coming in at 16? I'm assuming halfway through high school at that point.
Well, end of high school, yeah.
End of high school, and having to kind of start or create all your social networks outside of family from scratch, right? What were you thinking at that time in terms of like challenges and priorities for you? And looking back now, does it seem like it was easier or more difficult than that actual transition period when you were living through it?
At the beginning, when I first moved here, I was 16. I was starting my senior year of high school in Lima. So it was a very crucial year for me that, I wanted to live in Lima. And it was, yeah, at that moment for me, it was hard to accept that we were not staying for that, my last year of high school. And at that age, also, your priorities are different, and it was hard for me to adjust moving from Lima. Culturally, Peru and the US are very different. And in Peru, I was going to a private all girls Catholic school. And then here, I finished up my last year, and I had to do an additional year here. So 2 years of high school in the US. And I went to a public school here in the area, which was really good. But it was also a cultural shock for me at the beginning, not just with the language barriers, but also adjusting to, the culture of the education system, the people. And at first, it was a very difficult transition for me at that age. But now looking back, I'm thankful for the opportunity that I had to develop myself, because I feel that I grew more than I could have in that year than probably in the last 3 or so years of my childhood. So it was definitely a pivotal moment in my life. And I now looking back, even when I go to Peru, obviously I still connect with my friends from high school, but we have different mentalities and the way we see things. And I think that I would have been a totally different person if I would have stayed in Peru. And I think that now I have a different perspective on things. And yeah, and I'm grateful for that opportunity that I had.
So besides, of course, Washington, D.C. and Maryland and New York, you also have international experience beyond Peru, which is where you spent most of your childhood. Do you think that transition coming into the U.S. at a late stage in your adolescence was beneficial toward your ability to communicate across cultures later in life? For example, the time you spent in India or in Vietnam, which is where we met in 2015, or even in other places around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, I started my career in finance in New York. And although I didn't get the opportunity to get exposure or international exposure then, when I decided to make a switch and focus on social entrepreneurship and impact investing. As part of that transition, I moved to India and I work with a social enterprise in waste management. So moving from New York City, working at a top private corporate firm in New York to working in a small startup in India and it was not in the big cities in India. It was a small city that most people don't know. And
What was the name of it?
Vishakhapatnam.
Yeah, I've never heard of
Yeah, it's where the Navy is based in southeast.
Okay.
Yeah, I was one of the few expats living there in the city. So, and
it was noticeable then that
Yeah.
you were an expat.
yeah, it's noticeable. Yeah,
We'll
for
talk
sure.
more about that in a little bit, but please continue.
So when I was there, I mean, I was going from, I was going polar opposites as far as experience and exposure professionally. And I think I had the ability to connect with people locally, because I can understand their culture, even though it's different. In some ways, it's very similar to Latin American culture, and because of more traditions, values, and even people will tell me that they could connect better with me because they felt that I understood their values and culture better. So for me, in order to build relationships and have a good, work environment, it was crucial to kind of build that empathy with my colleagues. And I think that part of my cultural background definitely helped and it was crucial for that. And yes, I think that now I'm grateful that I also have the opportunity to blend in more of my cultural experience and background into my professional work, which I didn't get to before when I was working in financial services in New York.
I see. So the time that you spent in India, how long was that?
Overall, it was 2 years.
2 years in India. And so I imagine that across the spectrum of experiences that you had in India, some were unique or even extraordinary.
Yes.
Is there one or two in particular that come to mind where you were thinking, I don't think people are going to believe this is happening right now if I told them?
Yes. For me, poverty in India, and I think that in a lot of developing countries, we see this, but it's encapsulated in some areas. And in India, it was even in the good areas, if you want to call it, like you can still see it. It was, people on the streets, sleeping on the streets or, yeah, there are definitely some stories that I have that were very shocking and, kind of, brings up the reality of the country. And, I've lived in other countries, in Kenya and Peru and Mexico, but you can live in a bubble if you want to, in the good neighborhoods or where, a lot of young professionals live, where expats, but, it was not the case in India. You can see the realities of the country wherever you were. And I think for me, that was very unique and definitely gave me, a clear perspective of the realities of the country, not just from a poverty perspective, but also how the people want to connect with others. And that was part of the experience that I was telling you, that sometimes I used to walk in the streets and people will just stare at me as I was some alien walking. And it could be because, I'm dressed differently or they're not used to seeing someone like with a different look. And for me, that also gave me a lot of perspective of the culture and, the exposure that they get as well. And overall, I mean, everyone was really friendly. Although a lot of people ask me, how does it feel to live in India as a woman? For me, living in India, at least in the South, that's where I spent my 2 years, I felt pretty safe the entire time I was there and definitely have, had no problem walking at night or anything. I mean, the most I've had is people staring at me, but no one, really says anything inappropriate or even attempts to do, anything inappropriate. So in that sense, I know there's a lot of there are a lot of incidents that happen in India, but at least in the south and in some cities in India, it's pretty safe and people are friendly overall and very accommodating.
Was there ever a time where you didn't feel safe as a foreigner working in another country?
I will say yes. Sometimes for me, going to areas that, although you're going with other people, that, it doesn't matter if it's not safe. It's just not safe. And it happened to me in Peru, actually, when I was there a few months ago. I was doing a field visit, and one of the social enterprises that is part of the Nest portfolio, it's a company that works with inmates, and they do it's a clothing brand, and they produce all the clothes and accessories.
The name of the brand?
Pieta.
Pieta.
And they do all the manufacturing in the prison. And I was interviewing some of the inmates, and I had requested a special permission from the agency that monitors all the prisons in Peru. And, we were on our way there, and I had my cell phone stolen on my way there. And it was because it was not a good area, obviously, and I was not maybe putting enough care to where we were, and just someone just took out, like, through the window of the car, just
reached in and took your phone.
Exactly, yeah. And so, although I was with the founder, that he's also an expat and he goes there all the time, he was very surprised because, he didn't think that, we need to have the windows up or we had to have any security protocol to go there. But, so yeah. So for me, even when you feel like you're with someone that knows the area, sometimes that cannot mean anything because it goes beyond that, and yeah. So for me, the security going to some of these areas, I mean, it's not under even the control of the companies that are taking you there. So it's kind of on your own risk.
Now, before you had mentioned that when you were talking about your friends from high school in Peru and Lima specifically, that there is a distinction between your mindsets that you have, the outlook that you have on life. And I'm wondering, when you go back to Peru, is it a matter of deciding which hat you want to wear, in the sense that because you are both Peruvian and American, when you go back, you have that option to select how to engage with people, right? Is it something that people notice when you're back and interacting with them, or is it natural for you to transition in between those two roles or identity?
Yes, I think that I mean, that's who I am now, and that's what makes me unique, and my personality, it's blended, if you want to call it. But I can definitely relate and, yes, take more of a, like, wear another hat and understand the realities and, where people come from in Peru. It does not mean that I necessarily act or think the same way, but I can understand. And now that you mentioned that part of thinking differently from some of the people that I grew up with, I think when I made the career change at that point in my, like 5.5 years ago. Yeah. And I was, working in a big consulting firm in New York and making a decent salary, and left that behind to kind of venture into this new sector, which, for me, I knew it would require a pay cut. And I think the perception of how to develop as a professional here and in Peru sometimes can be very different, because in Peru, I feel like people don't understand sometimes the passion that I have for working in this sector. And although they think it's really cool and they all always say it's great, it looks like you love your job. I don't know if people will do it because, I left something that they perceive as better. Sometimes because it was a better pay, it was in a big company with a big name. And right now, it's definitely for me, from a financial perspective, a pay cut and sometimes not getting the recognition to work in a Deloitte or a Citigroup than working with a small social enterprise that is not known in the country. So I think that the perception of success means different things. And for me, it's more feeling rewarded for what I do and loving my job than making more money and working for a big company. That for me was the trade-off. And I mean, it for every person is different. So for me, I'm happy where I am right now. And I'm not saying that I wouldn't work for a big corporation, but the impact that I have through my professional career, I think is very important and what makes me be passionate about what I do.
Yeah, it's critical to feel fulfilled by the work that you do, not just professionally, but in your personal time as well, I believe. Do you think it's a matter of these folks that you're talking about being able to recognize a brand like the ones that you mentioned versus having never heard of the social enterprises that you now spend a lot of your time either working with or working for, and combining that also with perhaps not understanding social impact, social enterprise, impact investment? Do you think it's just a matter of them not diving deep enough to really understand the terms and the industry and then just saying, oh, yeah, well, everyone's heard of Citibank, for example, or Deloitte, at least if you're in the industry or if you're in business?
Yes. I think it's more of a mindset than knowledge gap. And I see more people are appreciating being an entrepreneur and being a social entrepreneur that has an impact or a social or environmental impact more. And in Peru, it now it's something that it's growing and is becoming more known. And there's an ecosystem that is really young, but it's developing. So I think as people understand more, there will be more appreciation for the work also. But I mean, overall, when people hear what I do, they think it's really cool. But it depends also in their perception of where they want to go professionally and what that means for them in terms of success. So I think it's more a perception and a mentality, that people are just kind of catching up to thinking that that is a career path that they can take. And before it was more, oh no, I have to work for, a well-known organization, because I used to think that way. For me, success at some point meant working for one of the top financial services company. And, it doesn't mean that anymore.
So for younger generations of not just Peruvians, but say Americans as well, what do you think was responsible for that shift in mindset? How are young people learning about these other avenues, these other opportunities? Is it through social media? Is it through mentorship? Is it through just, seeing examples of social entrepreneurs in the local newspaper or whatever way that they consume news?
Yeah, I would say social media is definitely one big channel, but also a lot of MBA programs, grad school programs are having a focus or have developed a news segment, or concentration within MBA program that you can focus on social entrepreneurship, or more specifically, even looking for opportunities in impact investing, which has been something that I did not see 10 years ago. So I think that it's not only the boom of entrepreneurship, but now also people becoming more socially aware of how they consume better. So looking for, sustainable social or enterprises that they can support. I think it's a little bit of what's happening in general, that we're all, as consumers, becoming more responsible and becoming more aware of some of the organizations that have a social or environmental mission.
Sure. That's definitely true. The awareness, of course, is a precursor to action. You can't really take action if you're not aware of an issue, or if you're aware of ways that you can help to make a positive impact. I was struck during my time in Peru by one, I'd say, the sense of community there, especially in contrast to here in the US, but also when I was in Piura, the amount of interest that there is in topics like entrepreneurship and innovation. I remember at a talk I gave, people were really deeply interested in, what's the solution for the challenges that they perceive in Peru. And one thing that Javier mentioned was that sometimes you'll have a company or an entrepreneur that's operating, and they won't even realize that there's a social mission or they're addressing a social need. And I found that quite fascinating, because it means that there's a lot more untapped value, or ways of measuring and quantifying it than we are currently. Of course, one of the big challenges is, how do you quantify impact, right? And how do you scale impact? And I'm wondering if you have seen similar challenges from an operational perspective in the various markets that you've been active in, like in Kenya, like in India, like in Mexico, and of course Peru? Or are the challenges so different that you can't really apply a framework and localize it in small ways so that it's adapted to the local setting and conditions?
Yes, I will say that one, how developed the support ecosystem has a lot to do with that. In Peru, like I mentioned, it's a very early stage, and a lot of people didn't even know what a social enterprise is. I mean, there is not a different organizations define it in their own ways, but there is not so a lot of people don't even know what that means, or didn't know like 2 years ago for sure in Peru. Now there is more of an ecosystem that is slowly developing. This year, there was a publication about the status of the social entrepreneurship ecosystem. So just the fact of that they're using the name as a term, it makes it more relevant for a lot of people, and that all there are a lot of opportunities that they can take advantage of being a social entrepreneur, that perhaps, like you mentioned, they didn't know or were aware that they could qualify, as. And in Kenya and India, as far as reality and problems, yes, there are a lot of models and that's part of the transferability of information that some organizations want to share, that, you don't have to, reinvent things from scratch, but, utilize or leverage some models that already exist that are successful to the extent possible to make it work in a different geography. I wouldn't say some models are, a copy and replicate easily, but you can take and learn from other people's experiences. The realities of each country are different, and my experience has been that in Africa and India, you can see very extreme poverty. In Peru, there is a lot of poverty, but I think the level of problems, because of certain developments that the country already has, it's not as bad, I will say. And healthcare, for example, in in East Africa, it's a real big issue, and in Africa in general, that perhaps in Peru although access to basic healthcare and vaccinations and getting to the last mile, it is a problem, a common problem, but you have all kind of another layer added to of healthcare issues that you see in Africa or in India too, that you don't see in Latin America. So yes, you can learn the lessons from other models in other regions, and I think that it has to be adjusted to the context of each country.
Great. And wondering, is there a time frame for you to be here in Washington, D.C.? Are you missing being abroad? Not necessarily Peru, of course, but elsewhere. And where is it that you would love to go but have not yet been?
Yes, I definitely miss being out in the field. Since I made this career change, I've been living abroad. I spent my first 2 years in India, 1 year in Kenya, and then 1 year in Mexico before I relocated back to the US. That didn't last too long. I ended up staying for 10 months and then moved to Peru. So it's been only, like I said, 2.5 months since I've been back. And although most of this segment of my career has been abroad and in developing countries, developing also my place within, an ecosystem in the US that can still support social entrepreneurship and impact investing is really important for me professionally. That doesn't mean that in the short term, I'm not going back to the field to continue the work that I've been doing. So yes, for now I'm in DC, but as an independent consultant, sometimes I'm here, sometimes I can be in another country for the next few months. But professionally, I have a focus for I have developed and I want to expand my knowledge and experience in Latin America. I think having a good understanding of other realities as I started this transition into this sector, and having exposure to India and Africa ecosystems, where it was really, really helpful and definitely helps me to have a better perspective. As I develop my career now, I want to focus more and do more work in Latin America, more for personal reasons, just to stay close to home. When you travel a lot and you go long distances, it gets, becomes more difficult to stay in one place and, live elsewhere.
Sure. And it seems that there is increasing interest in Latin America, especially with the announcements, SoftBank earlier this year about the investment that they're going to be focusing on in Latin America. And really a region that, from my perspective, the benefit is, with the exception of Brazil, of course, everyone speaks Spanish. That doesn't mean that you can just replicate across industries, because industries in different Latin American countries are at different levels of growth and sophistication. But that's one thing that I definitely noticed. I couldn't help but compare Southeast Asia to Latin America in, I think, largely superficial ways. But language I saw as a huge advantage in Latin America over Southeast Asia. Course, or at least 10 different markets in Southeast Asia, so 10 different languages. What I also found interesting about the time that I spent in Peru was that all the startups, all the small, medium-sized enterprises, if they want to expand, if they want to grow, they have to leave Peru, right? They have to pick a new market. Usually it's Mexico or Brazil or Chile or Colombia. And there's almost like this kind of forced or compelling integration of the region in that economic sense. I'm wondering if, for you spending more time in Latin America, it's helping to round out your own impressions and understandings of the region, right? Because we always we always look at folks who are coming from a region as having an advantage of knowing the region well. But what surprised me is when I'm asking people about what it's like in a different country, they've either only gone for vacation or they haven't been there at all. There seems to be a big disconnect in that sense of, flows of business people, commerce, trade, that sort of thing. But of course it exists there, right? And especially, or maybe I'm looking at it from Brazil and Mexico, right? The 1 and 2 largest economies in the region. Brazilian companies like Nubank moving into Mexico. And of course, the Mexican economy is large enough that the rest of the continent, or the rest of the region rather, is kind of like an afterthought. Wondering if anything has kind of surprised you going back to Latin America with a fresh perspective, so to speak, right? Because you grew up there, spent time outside, spent time outside the US in other places, and now you're going back with your collected experiences, so to speak. So I'm wondering if when you go back now, things are clicking, the dots are connecting in surprising ways.
Yeah, I've seen that entrepreneurs in general are making more efforts to be connected with other countries and other ecosystems, which I think is very important. And I see now there are different organizations that are supporting entrepreneurship in Peru, and that has grown a lot, not just from government initiatives that have funding for not specific social enterprises, but in general for entrepreneurship that are promoting this network, but also opportunities for these entrepreneurs to connect to, bigger regional networks and communities. And being able to feel that they're other and understand not just the realities in Peru, but in other regions. Because as you said, part of scaling up and expanding operations means that you're probably going to have to go out of Peru in order to scale. So having these connections and building your understanding of how things work in other countries, it is very important. So I was surprised to see that they are growing. There are a lot of opportunities that are available for entrepreneurs in Peru to get connected with the regional community. And I see a lot more entrepreneurs are participating and are attending conferences, joining, regional accelerator programs or events that definitely helps not only for the support, but for the understanding and the that you develop with these communities.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about when you were in Kenya, you must have seen the impact of China right there. And it's certainly hard to overlook what has been happening in terms of Chinese influence that has been rising, not just in Africa, but of course in Latin America as well. Is the impact that you've seen in places like in Kenya similar to the impact that you've noticed in Latin America as well, or is it on a different level?
Specifically for Chinese influence, and I mean, we've had an influence from China in Peru, I think, for a long time, but in not so much in services, more in products and finding suppliers, in China. But in Kenya, my experience was that even for services, like construction, developers, you see the influence of China in the country. And I haven't seen that so much in Peru, aside from products and suppliers.
And going back to the previous question, where's a place that you haven't yet visited, but you would like to spend more time?
In the Middle East.
In the Middle East, is there a place in particular?
I've been wanting to go to Lebanon.
Lebanon.
Because I think it's an interesting country and it has also a good support ecosystem for entrepreneurship. And also you mentioned Egypt, North Africa. think Morocco and Egypt are also two interesting countries that I will also like to visit soon. Because I see that there are different opportunities and support organizations that are within the ecosystem that are very interesting.
In the context of social enterprises and impact-driven missions for companies and organizations. Okay, got it. Yeah, really interesting. Middle East, I think often, especially here in the U.S., we think of different things other than entrepreneurship and innovation when talking about the Middle East. But you're absolutely right. I was in Egypt last year, scheduled to be back in November for the Vested Summit, which is a conscious tech event. So kind of the convergence of all these different themes that we're discussing, putting humanity first in the development and the drive of technology and finding ways to address the needs here on Earth while folks are trying to find ways to get on the moon and Mars. But it's I think difficult to keep in mind that the lifestyles that we see here, especially in a place like Washington D.C., is not the way the rest of the world lives. In fact, it's not the way that the majority of the world lives, and there's still, I think, 2 billion people without access to internet, for example, who've never been online. I mean, I think you and I have been online since the late 1990s, right? Even if it's with a 56K modem where you have to dial in. And of course, the experience of being online in developing markets is quite different. It's mobile first, right? They don't have laptops or desktops, and it's a very different experience to come online. And for, I think, a lot of places, maybe for some consumers in India, for them, the internet experience is Facebook, right? Like everything is done in this platform, communication, expression, and, well, we'll see, perhaps even payments.
Yes, and from a international development perspective, I see that, the digital development, it's definitely increasing initiative for a lot of these organizations. And as you said, having connectivity, it's, a requirement sometimes to get to even provide solutions to these communities or these remote or inaccessible communities. So I think as we see also in a larger scale how the international development agenda covers these aspects, it enables the development of these social enterprises and other business models to grow around that.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that you have an interest in the Middle East. If there's a social enterprise that's listening that wants to get in touch with you, or if someone's passing through Washington, D.C. and they'd like to reach out to you, what's the best way that people can get in touch with you?
By email
By email?
Yeah.
Do you want to give out
Yes. So my email is Mariella, Mariella B as in boy, ELLI.y@gmail.com. So mariella.belli.y@gmail.com. So that's my first name and my first last name. So yeah.
Cool. Well, for folks listening, hope they will get in touch with you if they're interested in social enterprise or if they're coming to Washington, D.C., hopefully when the weather is a little better.
Yes. Yes. So not only for entrepreneurs in the Middle East or North Africa, but any social entrepreneur or entrepreneur in general that would like to connect, that I'll be more than happy to have a conversation.
Yeah, and wondering if there is if there's any advice that you would like to offer for young people, especially those from places like Peru, for example, who are interested in or getting into social enterprise or impact-driven lines of work. What's the best way that they can do that, or at least learn more about it before making an informed decision?
Yes, I will say my recommendations are to get to understand the ecosystem and the organizations that are supporting entrepreneurship locally, but also abroad, and try to join a program that can give them that exposure to other regions as well. Because what happens is that funding in Peru or coming from local organizations is limited. So in one way or another, entrepreneurs are going to have to raise capital, and they need to have access or get connected to networks that are outside of Peru in order to raise the necessary capital to even start a pilot, even if it's philanthropic capital. And so I think it is very important to early on get connected to some of these regional organizations that support entrepreneurship, so you can get connected early on, because it is a long process. And develop your connections early on along with a strong business model, and try to get grants or philanthropic funding as your first capital as much as possible, because it's free money. Although, and founders have to put some skin in the game, that, there's nothing wrong with also getting external support to, pilot and test something. So I would say get connected early on and explore and get an understanding of the ecosystem locally, but also regionally.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice anywhere you're going to be operating. I truly, deeply understand what's the local context. And if you're interested, find ways to fill in the gaps that you perceive, and ways to add value in general, right?
Yeah.
In respectful ways, especially if you're a foreigner, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it definitely helps to be part of a bigger network. Sometimes you get recognition for being part of someone's portfolio, or have worked with another organization in the past. So that definitely helps build credibility for your business model, that someone has already supported you before. So, or you've gone through some due diligence process or selection process of another organization. It definitely helps you, it's a filter for other organizations. So I think that having that support definitely helps.
For sure. As we draw to a close, I always like to give the interviewee an opportunity to talk about anything that I haven't asked you yet. So it can be something about you, your profile, be something about Peru, it can be something about any of the places you lived, or if you would like to also talk about, for example, what's the best advice that you've ever received. It's very open-ended, and this is your time to talk about whatever you would like to.
So I will pick the advice one. I think professionally and as an entrepreneur or you need to develop leadership skills and also coaching and development skills for your own teams. So I think as much as possible, founders or whatever position you hold within an organization, it's something that sometimes is overlooked. And it's people tend to focus more on the technical part and undervalue the power of having those soft skills to actually, connect with people and being able to work with others well and manage a team well. So I think that, I will say that is my advice, that even as an entrepreneur, having a great idea and a great business model, at some point when your company scales, you're going to have a big team and they're going to have high expectations of you. And, having a good leader, it's also what drives the company to success. So I will say, try to develop, even if you're the technical and your team, those are skills that, sometimes are obvious that, we all need to develop as leaders, but, we don't take time to do it.
Yeah, definitely. I would say interpersonal skills are vital.
Yeah.
And in many parts of the world, including Asia, face-to-face communication is critical. You can't just hop on Zoom and expect to have the same level of rapport and the depth of the experience in order to build trust and to develop the relationship to a point where you're doing business or maintaining that level of relationship for the future. So really great advice. Thanks so much for taking the time to share a bit about your experience, not just in Peru, of course, but here in the US and abroad. We have a few places that we have both traversed, including New York, here, Vietnam, Mexico, Peru, most recently for me. So I'm excited for us to compare notes in the future about some future places. For me, the future is African. If you look at the population growth, by the end of the century, 1 out of 4 people will be African, and most of them will be young, right? And so it's very exciting. You have this groundswell of youth, but what does that mean in terms of opportunities? Because there's talent everywhere, right? So until next time, perhaps in DC, perhaps elsewhere, take care, and thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to seeing your next book too.
Thank you.
It's no secret that our experiences shape us from a young age. I was grateful that Mariella opened up about how her mindset changed based on her geography and how it helped her be more empathetic when dealing with others. Thanks, Mariella. And I know we'll see each other again, probably in a 3rd or 4th country in the future. That concludes this first season of the Planetary Potential podcast. I'm so glad that you listened through all 20 episodes, and I hope you stay tuned for Season 2 of the Planetary Potential, which I'll be sharing more details about soon. Thank you so much for listening.